In a time when nations trembled, kings wavered, and faith quietly eroded beneath outward prosperity, one man's life was forever changed inside the walls of the temple. His name was Isaiah. He did not begin as a hero, a ruler, or a warrior. He began as a witness. The moment came without warning. As Isaiah stood in the sacred place, he was confronted by a vision unlike anything human eyes were meant to see. God, exalted and enthroned, filled the temple with overwhelming glory. Heavenly beings proclaimed holiness so powerful that the very foundations seemed to shake. In that instant, Isaiah understood something terrifying and profound. He was standing before absolute holiness while carrying human imperfection. Overwhelmed, Isaiah did not boast or resist. He confessed. He acknowledged his own unworthiness and the brokenness of the people around him. Yet, instead of destruction, he encountered mercy. A divine act of cleansing transformed his fear into purpose. What could have been an ending became a beginning. Then came the question that echoes across history: whom shall I send? And Isaiah's answer was not forced. It was not demanded. It rose freely from a transformed heart. Here am I. Send me. This moment was not just Isaiah's calling, it was the birth of a voice that would shape generations. From that vision flowed warnings of judgment, cries for justice, promises of hope, and prophecies of salvation that would reach far beyond his lifetime. Isaiah would speak to kings and common people alike, calling them back to faith, righteousness, and trust in God rather than human power. This is not just an ancient story. It is a reminder that transformation begins when truth is faced and purpose is accepted. If stories like this inspire you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey through timeless biblical history. Let's explore these powerful stories together. After the vision in the temple, Isaiah did not walk back into the world as the same man. The holiness he had witnessed reshaped the way he saw everything around him. The streets of Jerusalem no longer appeared merely busy or prosperous. Beneath the surface, Isaiah perceived a deep fracture between outward religion and inward truth. The people still brought offerings, still spoke the language of faith, and still gathered in sacred spaces. Yet their daily lives told a very different story. Isaiah saw a society where moral clarity had slowly eroded. Idolatry had crept in quietly, not always through carved images, but through misplaced trust. Wealth, power, and political influence began to take the place that belonged to God alone. The pursuit of comfort and status dulled the people's sense of responsibility toward one another, and over time, compassion became selective. Those with influence accumulated land and resources, while the poor were pushed to the margins, unseen and unheard. What troubled Isaiah most was not only the injustice itself, but the way it was justified. Religious rituals continued with precision, prayers were recited, and festivals were observed. Yet these acts had become disconnected from ethical living. Isaiah understood that worship, when separated from justice, loses its meaning. Faith that ignores suffering becomes hollow, no matter how carefully it is performed. In his eyes, the problem was not that people had abandoned religion, but that they had reduced it to appearance rather than obedience. Isaiah's message cut through this contradiction with unsettling clarity. He spoke against leaders who protected their own comfort while neglecting the vulnerable, and against communities that tolerated inequality as if it were inevitable. He reminded them that God had never desired rituals offered by hands stained with exploitation. True devotion, Isaiah insisted, could not exist alongside indifference to suffering. To honor God was to defend the oppressed, to act with fairness, and to show compassion to those who had no power to protect themselves. This was not a popular message. Isaiah's words challenged assumptions that prosperity was proof of righteousness, and that tradition alone guaranteed divine approval. By exposing the gap between what the people claimed to believe and how they actually lived, Isaiah disrupted a comfortable illusion. He made it impossible to hide behind ceremony while ignoring responsibility. His voice forced listeners to confront an uncomfortable truth. Injustice was not a social accident, but a spiritual failure. Yet Isaiah's condemnation was never driven by bitterness. Beneath his sharp warnings lay a profound desire for restoration. He believed that change was possible, that hearts could be renewed, and that society could be rebuilt on principles of justice and mercy. His calls to repentance were invitations, not final verdicts. He urged the people to turn away from practices that dehumanized others and to return to a faith that transformed both worship and daily life. Isaiah's message connected directly to the vision that had first shaped him. Having stood before perfect holiness, he understood that God's presence could not coexist with hypocrisy. The same holiness that cleansed him now compelled him to speak. Justice, righteousness, and compassion were not optional ideals. They were the visible evidence of a living faith. Without them, worship became noise, tradition became empty motion, and belief lost its power. Through Isaiah's words, the people of Judah were confronted with a choice. They could continue maintaining the appearance of devotion while ignoring its substance, or they could allow their faith to reshape how they treated one another. Isaiah knew that this choice would define not only their spiritual future, but the fate of their society. His voice echoed through the city as a reminder that God's concern extended beyond temples and rituals, reaching into homes, marketplaces, courts, and hearts. In this way, Isaiah's condemnation was also an act of hope. By exposing what was broken, he pointed toward what could still be restored, if the people were willing to listen. As Isaiah continued to speak into the life of Judah, his message grew even more urgent as danger gathered beyond the city walls. The world around them was shifting, and powerful empires were on the move. Assyria, relentless and expanding, cast a long shadow across the region, and fear spread through the courts of kings and the streets of ordinary people alike. In moments like these, survival seemed to depend on strategy, negotiation, and strength. Many believed the future of Judah rested in treaties, armies, and carefully chosen alliances with foreign powers. Isaiah saw this fear clearly, and he understood its source. The people were not simply afraid of invasion. They were afraid of uncertainty. Trusting in something visible and measurable felt safer than trusting in a God who could not be seen. Political agreements offered immediate reassurance, military power promised control, and foreign alliances created the illusion of security. Yet to Isaiah, these solutions revealed the same spiritual fracture he had already confronted within society. Once again, human confidence was replacing divine trust. Isaiah's warnings did not come from naivety about politics or warfare. He knew the strength of Assyria and the limits of Judah's defenses, but his perspective had been shaped by the vision in the temple, where he had seen a power far greater than any empire. Having stood before the true ruler of history, Isaiah could not remain silent while leaders placed their hope in fragile human systems. He reminded them that alliances formed without God's guidance carried hidden costs, slowly pulling the nation away from its spiritual foundation. When kings weighed their options, Isaiah spoke with calm urgency. He urged them not to be ruled by fear or pressured by appearances. The threat before them was real, but surrendering their trust to foreign powers would only deepen their vulnerability. What appeared to be wisdom in the eyes of the world, Isaiah warned, could become a trap that led to greater loss. Dependence on military strength might delay disaster, but it could not bring lasting security. This message tested the patience of rulers who were desperate for quick solutions. Isaiah's counsel demanded something far more difficult than strategic planning. It required faith. To trust in God during a crisis meant resisting panic, refusing shortcuts, and believing that obedience mattered more than immediate advantage. Isaiah challenged the kings to remember their history, to recall moments when deliverance came not through numbers or weapons, but through trust and humility. The tension between Isaiah and the political leadership of Judah grew as fear intensified. Advisors urged alliances, envoys were sent to foreign courts, and preparations for defense continued. Yet Isaiah's voice remained steady. He did not promise that trusting God would be easy, nor did he suggest that hardship would disappear. Instead, he insisted that relying on God was the only path that preserved the nation's identity and purpose. Isaiah understood that the issue at stake was larger than survival. If Judah placed its hope in human power, it would slowly reshape its values to match those it depended upon. Faith would become secondary, justice would weaken, and obedience would be compromised for convenience. Trusting God, on the other hand, required courage, patience, and moral clarity, qualities that Isaiah believed were essential for the nation's future. In moments when fear threatened to overtake reason, Isaiah pointed beyond the immediate crisis to a deeper truth. Nations rise and fall, alliances shift, and military strength fades, but God's sovereignty remains unchanged. By calling the people and their leaders to trust in God alone, Isaiah was not rejecting wisdom or preparation. He was redefining where ultimate confidence should rest. This message connected seamlessly with everything Isaiah had already proclaimed. Just as true worship demanded justice and compassion, true security demanded faith. Both required a willingness to place obedience above appearance and trust above control. Isaiah's warnings were not meant to isolate Judah from the world, but to anchor it firmly in a relationship that could not be shaken by threats or fear. In urging the nation to rely on God rather than human power, Isaiah continued his relentless call to return to what truly sustained them. As the story unfolds, Isaiah's role expands from a solitary voice of warning into a steady presence at the very heart of Judah's most critical moments. His words no longer echo only in public squares or private visions, but reach the chambers of kings themselves, where decisions are made that shape the fate of the nation. In these tense spaces, Isaiah stands as a reminder that leadership carries spiritual weight, and that every choice made under pressure reveals where true trust lies. When King Ahaz faces the threat of invasion, fear clouds his judgment. Surrounded by uncertainty, he looks for solutions he can control, weighing political calculations and military options. Isaiah approaches him not with condemnation, but with an invitation to faith. He urges Ahaz to remain calm and to resist being driven by panic, reminding him that events unfolding around him are not beyond God's authority. It is in this fragile moment that Isaiah speaks of a sign, a promise meant to cut through fear and restore perspective. The message of Emmanuel, God with us, emerges not as an abstract idea, but as reassurance that divine presence remains even when danger feels close and overwhelming. This promise, rooted in immediate crisis, also stretches beyond it. Isaiah weaves together the present and the future, showing that God's involvement in history is not limited to one king or one generation. The sign becomes a thread connecting fear-filled decisions with enduring hope, reinforcing Isaiah's larger message that trust in God is never misplaced, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Later, under King Hezekiah, Isaiah's counsel is tested again. Assyria, the empire that had dominated the region, now stands at Judah's gates. The threat is direct, public, and impossible to ignore. Where alliances and defenses once seemed appealing, they now appear fragile against such power. In this moment, Isaiah's earlier warnings gain clarity. He encourages Hezekiah to turn not to foreign help, but to prayer and humility. The response is strikingly different from earlier fears. Rather than rushing toward human solutions, the king pauses and listens. What follows becomes one of the most defining moments in Judah's memory. Isaiah records a miraculous deliverance that reinforces everything he has proclaimed. The outcome is not presented as a triumph of strategy or strength, but as a demonstration that history does not belong solely to empires. The intervention confirms Isaiah's conviction that God's sovereignty operates beyond visible forces, shaping events in ways human power cannot predict or control. Isaiah's vision, however, extends far beyond Judah's borders. He turns his prophetic gaze outward, addressing nations that appear untouchable in their dominance. Through his proclamations against powerful foreign kingdoms, Isaiah challenges the assumption that strength guarantees permanence. These messages do not arise from hostility, but from a consistent understanding of history as something guided by a higher authority. By declaring judgments against nations that seem invincible, Isaiah reminds his audience that no power exists independently of God's will. This global perspective reinforces the unity of Isaiah's message. The same God who calls Judah to trust is the God who oversees the rise and fall of every nation. Political boundaries and military achievements may shape the world temporarily, but they do not determine its ultimate direction. Isaiah presents history as a carefully woven narrative, where arrogance leads to decline and humility opens the door to renewal. Through counsel to kings, promises spoken in fear, recorded deliverance, commissioned classes, and pronouncements to distant nations, Isaiah creates a coherent vision of faith and authority. Each moment builds upon the last, forming a story in which trust becomes the defining measure of leadership and survival. His message never drifts into abstraction. It remains grounded in real decisions, real dangers, and real consequences. In this way, Isaiah does more than interpret events. He frames them within a larger understanding of purpose and meaning, by showing that God remains present with individuals, nations, and history itself. Isaiah invites his audience to see beyond immediate outcomes. The story he tells is not only about judgment or hope, but about recognizing who truly holds the future. Yet Isaiah's story does not remain anchored in warning and consequence alone. Threaded through every declaration of judgment is a quieter, steadier current of hope, one that rises precisely where despair might otherwise take hold. Having revealed the cost of pride and misplaced trust, Isaiah turns his audience's attention toward what remains when false securities fall away. He speaks of a faithful remnant, not as an idealized group of the powerful or the righteous in appearance, but as those refined through hardship, preserved not by strength but by grace. Their survival is itself a sign that failure is never the final word, and that renewal often begins with those who seem least visible. From this promise of continuity, Isaiah's vision stretches forward, drawing from the ancient covenant with David to announce the coming of a ruler unlike any the world has known. This future king does not rise through conquest or political ambition, but through righteousness and wisdom. Isaiah portrays him as a source of stability in a fractured world, a leader whose authority rests not on fear but on justice, whose reign restores what corruption has eroded. The image is deliberately set against the unstable leadership Isaiah has already described, offering a contrast that invites reflection on what true power looks like when aligned with divine purpose. Yet Isaiah does not stop with images of triumph and order. In a turn that deepens the story rather than softening it, he introduces the figure often described as the suffering servant. This servant does not command armies or occupy thrones. Instead, he bears pain, rejection, and silence in the face of injustice. Through this figure, Isaiah reveals a form of redemption that works from within suffering rather than escaping it. The servant's endurance transforms loss into healing and turns sacrifice into a path toward restoration. It is a vision that challenges expectations, suggesting that salvation may arrive not through dominance, but through compassion and faithfulness in the face of hardship. As these images unfold, Isaiah's hope widens beyond the borders of Judah. The peace he describes is not limited to one nation or one people. He envisions a future where conflict gives way to understanding, where long-standing hostilities lose their grip, and where nations learn to coexist without fear. This is not presented as a sudden erasure of history's wounds, but as a gradual reorientation of human priorities, guided by a shared recognition of justice and truth. In this future, strength is no longer measured by the ability to dominate, but by the willingness to pursue peace. Isaiah's message reaches its broadest expression in his proclamation of salvation for all peoples. The God who has spoken through Israel, guided kings, and judged empires now extends an invitation beyond familiar boundaries. Isaiah portrays a world where those once considered distant or excluded are drawn into the same promise of restoration. This universal vision does not replace earlier warnings, but completes them, showing that judgment serves a purpose larger than punishment. It clears the way for renewal that includes every nation willing to walk in humility and trust. By weaving these promises into the larger narrative, Isaiah ensures that hope does not feel detached from reality. It emerges directly from the struggles already described, offering continuity rather than escape. The faithful remnant, the righteous ruler, the suffering servant, and the promise of peace all arise from the same conviction that history is moving toward meaning rather than chaos. Isaiah's hope is not naive optimism, but a steady assurance that beyond collapse and uncertainty, restoration is possible. In this way, the prophet transforms the story he has been telling. What began with a vision of holiness and a call to speak now expands into a future shaped by mercy, justice, and belonging. Isaiah invites his listeners to endure the present with courage, knowing that the final chapter is not defined by loss, but by a hope that reaches every corner of humanity. As Isaiah's vision reaches its final horizon, the story lifts its eyes beyond the struggles of kings, nations, and generations. Toward a future where restoration is complete and nothing broken remains beyond healing. After confronting corruption, warning of misplaced trust, and revealing hope through promise and perseverance. Isaiah now speaks of a world made whole. This is not a distant fantasy detached from history, but the fulfillment of everything he has already proclaimed. The same God who judged injustice and preserved a faithful remnant now reveals the destination toward which all of history has been moving. Isaiah describes a restored world shaped by justice that no longer falters and peace that does not depend on fragile agreements. Suffering gives way to healing, not as a temporary relief, but as a lasting condition of life itself. What was once marked by fear and loss is transformed into security and joy. Violence no longer defines relationships, and sorrow no longer sets the rhythm of human existence. The imagery Isaiah uses is rich and deliberate, inviting listeners to imagine a reality where harmony replaces conflict and dignity replaces despair. At the center of this vision stands God's presence, no longer obscured by distance or misunderstanding. Isaiah assures believers that restoration is not driven by human effort alone, but by divine faithfulness. The promise of new heavens and a new earth signals not an escape from creation, but its renewal. Everything that has been bent by injustice, suffering, or failure is reshaped according to its original purpose. Life is no longer fragile or fleeting, but filled with meaning that endures. This future also brings clarity to Isaiah's earlier message. Judgment, suffering, and waiting were never the final goal. They were steps along a path leading toward redemption. The faithful are not forgotten, their endurance is honored, and their hope is fulfilled. Isaiah's vision affirms that no act of faithfulness is wasted and no season of hardship is meaningless. Even when the present feels uncertain, the direction of God's plan remains steady. Isaiah's closing vision offers reassurance rather than urgency. It invites believers to rest in the knowledge that history is not drifting toward chaos, but toward joy. The brokenness of the world is not permanent, and the longing for peace planted in human hearts is not accidental. It points forward to a time when creation itself reflects harmony, when justice is natural rather than demanded, and when joy flows without interruption. As this story comes to an end, it leaves behind more than prophecy. It leaves assurance. Isaiah's message, spoken across centuries, reminds us that the final word belongs not to fear, loss, or conflict, but to renewal and hope. The future he describes is one where God's promises stand fully revealed, and where redemption is complete. Thank you for spending this time listening to the story of Isaiah and his extraordinary vision of hope and restoration. If this journey through biblical history has inspired you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can continue exploring these timeless stories with us.